This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Monday, November 2nd, 2020. We'll be finishing up with the ethics today, and on Wednesday we're turning to the politics. And so we turn to books 8, 9, and 10. Friendship and pleasure. It's not astounding, I guess, that the ethics in its last reflections turns back to this old question of pleasure and the good, as we'll see. But it is amazing that Aristotle spends 2 books of a book on happiness and virtue on friendship. It's interesting and amazing, as I say in my notes. Why does he do this? I think it's because friendship points back to happiness and virtue. As you'll see, he says that you really can't be happy in life unless you have friends, good friends. I think he pretty comes close to suggesting you can't be virtuous if you don't have friends, good friends. It more or less embodies philosophy, as we're going to see towards the end of Book 9. It's not an exaggeration, but it's almost as if Aristotle comes close to saying that you can't do philosophy without friends. That contemplation, which is what Aristotle calls, the path to wisdom, the highest perfection of the intellect. It's not meditating in some cave by yourself on a mountaintop somewhere. And of course, you'll probably recognize some dimensions of the dialectic here. And as you'll see, it almost embodies, and the word I think of is enables human being at its best and most pleasant, which points forward to Book 10. In fact, this is a nice phrase that came to my mind as I was preparing these comments. I think Aristotle thinks that friendship is the ladder up to humanity, the ladder up to human being, human identity. And therefore, it's not only not surprising when you think about it that Aristotle spent so much time on friendship, because such a relationship is obviously so key to our happiness, our goodness, and our completion as human beings. And as you'll see, it's also there are parts of these 2 books that are remarkably political. It turns out that friendship, as the last book of the ethics does, then in some ways the last 3 books of the ethics point forward to the completion of this topic in politics. In politics, literally, and in the politics, literally. The other interesting thing about teaching this material is I've been teaching Plato and Aristotle, or their works, I should say, for a long time. And these 2 books of the ethics tend to be my students' favorite books in Aristotle. First of all, Aristotle's not as much fun to read as Plato. Each of these authors is difficult, but Plato's often quite interesting and dramatic. You get to shout with the crowd in the Apology. You get to share Euthyphro's irritation. And even perhaps at times Socrates' song of the dialectic in the Republic almost charms you to want to have spent that 12 to 14 hour all-night party discussing the nature of justice. But Aristotle, in his mode of writing, which we've already reflected on, I think there is a deliberate choice to write differently, to write explicit treatises, which are also more boring. And I have to say that tends to be the reaction of most students to Aristotle. Oh, this is so dry. But it might not surprise you to discover that I love Aristotle, and I love reading Aristotle, although it's not easy. And so why, of all the works of Aristotle, the rhetoric, the poetics, the physics, the ethics, the politics, metaphysics that I've taught parts of or all of, why this one? I think it's because young people want lots of things in life. They want a happy future. They want a good job. They want a happy marriage. They want all the pleasures and even, if you will, the pains in life. But young people desperately want friends. And he has a lot to say to young people about friendship in these 2 books. One thing I've read these books all my life. I read them when I was young, and I've read them when I was old. And here's one thing you can absolutely be certain of. He's absolutely right when he says people don't want to be around old people and sour people. Because those tend to be the same things. Just look at Dr. Dunn. Anyway, so uh, young people, they're so desperate for confirmation in the eyes of their friends that if it's taken away from them, then they almost lose their ability to go on. And social media apparently have made this even worse, where uh, it's actually increased the almost addictive dependency on digital friendship. I don't know. That's but the young, as he says, young people make friends easily and drop them easily. They go through friends like that, and they need them desperately, and they go because it turns out that youthful friendships are often based upon the most superficial aspects of friendship, either just circumstance, habituation, um, and as you'll see, two of the three bases of pleasure of friendship can be pleasure and usefulness, and the young are all into pleasure, as he says, because in a way they're closer to their natural foundations. Now, that doesn't mean that philosophy in old age take you away from your natural foundations, but what he means is, as you'll see, is uh, older people are more cultivated people. The irony of Aristotle's teaching on almost all these great questions of rhetoric and ethics and politics is the more cultivated you are, the more natural you are in one sense. Now, that's kind of contradictory because we tend to think of convention and culture and artifice as going away from nature. But as you're going to see, especially in the politics, Aristotle argues that no, culture, convention, nature, shaping, education are actually not anti-nature. They are necessary to complete our nature, as it turns out. So, anyway, let's kind of work through this material and we'll see what we can see about it. So let's first look at the kinds of friendship. And this goes back to the beginning of the ethics, that turns out that friendships can form on the basis of goodness and virtue, the best kind, of course, and the most lasting and true kinds, as he points out. Usefulness, people will come together and hang out because it turns out they derive some instrumental benefit from it. And by the way, you'll see in some of the parts of books 9 and 10, this is what allies, almost a political dimension of this, that's citizens of the same city are friends. The friends of the citizens of different cities are allies. Cities can be allies, and business partners are allies. They're kinds of a friendship, but these are friendships or relationships which are really based simply on utility and exchanged benefit. And then, of course, there are friendships based on pleasure, and he does include sexual pleasure here, and I think he's more or less got American marriage down. He says at one point, those you can have a friendship that begins in pleasure, but then it turns out that you can actually come to know somebody pretty well and appreciate their best and your best, and in a relationship in which you're trying to make yourself a good person, and the other person the best person they are, that's friendship based on goodness and virtue. And I think he comes very close to suggesting that's what a happy marriage is. Most Americans, of course, most moderns believe in a marriage based on choice, which means love. And Aristotle's pretty clear this means infatuation and shared pleasure. And if it doesn't become friendship, then it doesn't last very long or doesn't last very happily. And so I think he's got these kinds of friendship. How does this harken back to the beginning? Because it turns out that the things that people go into friendship for are pretty much the things that people look for happiness in. And on the question of money, power, those are actually all, you might say, instrumental utilities. Pleasure and goodness. So as you'll see, that interestingly enough, the three kinds of friendship point back to the kinds of happiness that people pursue at the beginning of the ethics, and they'll point forward to the kinds of as again this deep and persistent question of pleasure and the good in Book 10. So if you're looking at the notes, I suggest to sum up these two chapters, you need several keywords that really distill his essential teaching on friendship: equality, reciprocity, beneficence, and mirror and ladder. That's my way to sum up what he seems to mean at the end of Book 8 and Book 9 as to why the good life needs friends. So those are the images of mirror and ladder that come to mind. So equality. It's very difficult for unequal human beings to be friends, even though he says there are kinds of friendship available between unequals, like there's a kind of friendship between parents and children. And he's very descriptive, I think, as to what the pleasure in children that parents have. And he points out, and we've talked about this in some ways when we talked about Eros in the Republic, children are a form of immortality for parents. They're an extension of themselves into the future. They are themselves, and parents, whether or not they admit it, it's not just that they want to leave genetic progeny behind. They want their children to embody their visions of goodness too, which is a kind of friendship. And then he says, what the friendship of child towards parent is, or father towards son towards father, or even towards mother, is the gratitude in having been brought into being and given your life. And between wealthy and poor, and powerful and non-powerful, and his point here is while there is some kind of friendship possible between unequals, it's very difficult to be friends with somebody with whom you're really in inequality of, including, by the way, even virtue to some degree, although it's more possible with inequalities of virtue than it is with other kinds of inequalities. And so, and as you'll see, like many other parts of the ethics and of the politics, there's a whiff of just the discussion of tyranny here, because one of the things you'll see, and there's a knock at tyranny in these two books, as there is in Book 10 on pleasure. Tyranny destroys the tyrant, it destroys the people around him, it destroys the city, and because what the tyrant wants is power. And when you get this inequality of power, then it turns out, just as Harry reminds Voldemort, you have no friends, you have no love. That's the misery of being a tyrant. In getting this instrumental power, you turn yourself into an inequality vis-a-vis the other people in the city, and you destroy any possibility of friendship with them. So even though, again, remember, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero are all united against nihilistic hedonistic pleasure, they are all united against tyranny too. And you would think, why do these authors need to spend so much time knocking tyranny? Nobody seems to like tyranny, but as we saw in the Republic, and to some degree, as he points out here, people praise, they say they hate tyrants, but they all want to be a tyrant because they mistake the nature of the good. So equality seems to be necessary for friendship. At least the better kinds of friendship are relationships between whom you share that quality. Although friendships of utility can be remarkably unequal and still exist, of course, until the utility either disappears or the usefulness disappears. Same with pleasure too. And he notes, by the way, that pleasure, that lovers, as we mean falling in love and being in love with somebody, is not quite friendship, because it's also an equality, and they're really opposites. And if you've ever, by the way, had the let's be friends rather than lovers discussion, then you know that he's right, that to some degree being in love is a kind of a deep and profound and almost addictive need. Friendship is also a need, but it's a calm and sober and nevertheless joyous need. Reciprocity. Friends are good-willed towards each other. That's almost the definition of what good friendship is. Friendship in the good and in virtue. And by the way, part of this interesting point about the reciprocity of friendship, that is to say, let me just get the point out. It's not, friendship is based on goodwill, but it isn't just goodwill, because you can have goodwill towards strangers and everything like that. You can have goodwill to people you don't even know. But Aristotle says, no, that's not quite friendship. Friendship is when it's reciprocal, when you will the beneficence to somebody else, and that other person is aware of it and wants to return it. and this reciprocity and one of the difficult parts of these two chapters, I'm not sure I fully understand it, is both the similarity and difference between justice and friendship. And you remember in Book 5, Aristotle suggests that justice is most a mean because it's like a mean between being good to yourself and others. And this question is it better to love yourself or to love other people? He raises this question again in books 8 and 9, and he says, well, if it's based on the bad kinds of character and vice, then it's terrible to love yourself because you're actually damaging yourself, because you're loving yourself for the wrong reasons and pointing yourself downward. But if your character is pointed up to the good, if you really aspire to virtue and goodness in the best sense, then loving yourself's not so bad, because loving yourself means you'll almost be good to somebody else. And you'll see that it goes beyond this, but that to some degree, in having the reciprocity of friendship is necessary, because that's where you find the balance between self and others too. So friendship isn't justice. It seems to contain elements of justice, but he suggests that whereas in a relationship based on justice, you're constantly measuring, trying to find the mean between what you deserve and what the other person deserves, that desert is a matter of fairness, as we saw in Book 5. But because of the generosity and beneficence of friendship, you don't care so much about whether you're getting back what you give, whether you find the mean point of dessert. I don't mean like chocolate pudding. I mean, of course, what you deserve. And because in some ways, even though friendship is based on reciprocal beneficence, it doesn't mean that you're not entering into friendship so that the other person is good to you. You're entering into friendship because you want to be beneficent to that other person, because it's good for you to be beneficent. And that brings us to the next keynote. Friendship is a form of goodwill. It's beneficence. It's reciprocal beneficence. And Aristotle suggests again that this shows why the tyrant just can't be happy. Because the tyrant doesn't want to be beneficent towards anybody. The tyrant wants to turn everyone else into an instrument of their use and his power, her power. So, and again, this notion of beneficence, I think, is what reconciles so many tensions in friendship, and in human life, for that matter. If you want to be good for yourself in terms of reaching the good yourself, you will discover that you can't do that without others. Again, this is not sitting alone contemplating your navel in a cave. Remember, friendship is an activity. It's an action. It's a being at work, just like virtue is. And that's why he says, strictly speaking, when you're falling asleep, you're not, in the same way that when you're falling asleep, you're not quite virtuous. When you're dead, you're not quite virtuous. But friendship is an activity. It's an active relationship of beneficence. And last, when he raises the question, why do you need friends? And by the way, it gets into that interesting question, can you have too many friends? Yeah, you can have too many friends, because as you're going to see, this points forward to Book 2 in the Politics, which is also, you're going to discover this is actually in Book 2 of the Politics, I'll just give you a heads up, is Aristotle's great response to Plato's notion of the political in the Republic, which rests upon the denial or destroying of the private. And as you're going to see, for Aristotle, the political requires the preservation and even enhancement of the public, of the private. And to some degree, one of the things you'll see in Book 2 is in trying to make everyone love the city as the primary object of their love, where everyone in the city says, this is my son of every child or daughter, and etc. This is my husband, meaning the abolition of the family and private property. Aristotle says love becomes watery, and so it's not enough. It's good to love humanity. It's good to want to have generalized goodwill, as opposed to being a Scrooge, but that's not friendship. Friendship is an intense, active, reciprocal relationship of beneficence. And last is mirror and ladder. It turns out that, again, that the best human beings, not, even though there's a kind of a self-sufficiency to human life, and Aristotle says this is a good thing, nevertheless, why do we need friends? Well, it turns out, as he says, a friend's like another one of us. It's like a mirror of our soul. And we need that. In the Poetics, by the way, Aristotle says art, poetic imitation, which, by the way, Plato pretty much downplays, I think, in order to dethrone it in the Republic. But in Aristotle's works, art is pretty important. And to be sure, if you remember, Socrates doesn't completely ban artists and poets from the city. He wants to teach them how to sing patriotic songs and clean up the stories of the gods. It's true, philosophy tames poetry in the Republic. Aristotle embraces poetry and art and thinks that it's one of the ladders up to human identity and philosophy too. And so is friendship. So, so we need the friend, this other, first of all, because this is actually the connecting point between the last point of beneficence and mirror and ladder, is that we actually want somebody to be beneficent too. I think you would say that, for instance, we naturally want to be parents. We want to, not because we're afraid of death and we want to have children to make us feel immortal, but and that's all true, by the way, and we do want children to grant us immortality, at least students, if we can't have children or cats. But we want to be beneficent towards others, and we do, in a sense, want them to see that beneficence and give it back to us. Although, remember, we're not being good to other people so that they will be good to us. We need other people, and especially friends, to be beneficent too, because that actually completes our own goodness. Now, the mirror and ladder again. We also need friends because we're not gods. And when he says, we would almost wish somebody to be a god or wish ourselves to be a god, not because we could do whatever we want, but because gods apparently are completely self-sufficient in what they are, and the God, as he says in the Ethics, thought thinking itself that completes the cone of the universe. Well, but it turns out human beings, we are that in a way, but we really need the other to both to see our own good and to reflect ourselves. It's like Aristotle says in Book 9 that the friend is another soul, and so when he says friends share all things in common, the good friends share all the good things. If you really aspire to be a happy person through making yourself virtuous, then you'll need friends because and there's a poignant dimension in this. He says, "Friends, we need friends in both good and bad fortune to share our good fortune and to help us bear our bad fortune. Although it's better to be a friend sharing good fortune than sharing bad fortune, but we need them in both circumstances." So we need that mirror. But the last sense of which friendship is necessary is the ladder. And here, by the way, I think that he means that our if we have true friendships based on real grasp of our character, the things that matter, the friends that, and I think he's right about this. I mean, again, I read this book when I was young, and I'm teaching this grip and read it when I'm old, and I have to say here he's just right. The friendships that have lasted a lifetime, and I've had very good friends all my life. They really do depend upon the real you. And if you're an asshole or a shit, then you probably won't have many friends. But if you're really devoted to trying to being a good person, I'm not patting myself on the back here, then, but if you really pursue the things that matter, both the serious and the pleasant things, a phrase that he uses throughout these two books and the last book, the serious and the pleasant things, those are the friendships that will really last your whole life. And in some ways will become as important to you as family. In fact, it's family in the best sense, your best friends. So, but the deepest sense, of course, in which we need the friend is if we do pursue philosophy. It turns out that our friends, if we're pursuing philosophy, again, philosophy is not just closing your eyes, gazing off to eternity at the top of some mountain. Friendship is an activity, and so is virtue, and so is the intellectual life. And I think what you see here in the last parts of Book 9 are an anticipation of, or an echo of, perhaps that's the better word, of the dialectic. Philosophy is a dialectical activity. And And the best kinds of friendships will be the ones in which you both join hands, pursue the truth, and gaze into eternity, not in the sense of self-contained meditation, but in terms of the exchange of two souls, uh, actively engaged in a common and shared quest for the truth. So, the other interesting thing, and this points us to D on the notes, is how political this discussion of friendship is. Because, and I think this is part of the answer, as I said above, as to why Aristotle devotes 2 books on friendship in the Ethics. Because, just to go back to what he says at the beginning of the book, the Ethics is part 1 of the Politics. This is a 2-part book called Ethics and Politics, and the title of the whole book is Politics. It all comes back to politics for Aristotle, although not in the sense of a modern cultural Marxist where everything is political, like many current dimensions of social reform. Here, everything's political because human being is perfected in politics and needs politics. We'll come back to this in a bit, but one reason that this discussion of friendship points forward to the politics is because it turns out that citizenship is a kind of friendship, and in some ways, it's an equalizer. It's reciprocal. It's not. Citizenship isn't friendship simply, but it's a kind of friendship, or friendship is a kind of a basis of citizenship, which is, as I think, a good account of patriotic sentiment and the love of one's fellow country person, as their shared thumos is in the Republic. So in a way, this discussion of friendship is I think necessary to anticipate the discussion, especially the discussion of citizenship in Book 3 of the Politics. Now, there's another very big issue that Aristotle is articulating here, and this points to a difference between the ancient political philosophers and the modern political philosophers that I have mentioned several times, among the other great differences between antiquity and modernity, respecting us who find ourselves in the middle of modernity and its unfolding for better or worse, and better and worse. But you have to say that this great question that distinguishes Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero on the one hand, and even the medievals like Aquinas, Augustine, and Maimonides, and on the one hand, and Machiavelli, Descartes, Spinoza, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, all the moderns, is on the naturalness of politics. If you've read The Leviathan by Hobbes, you know that Hobbes concludes that man is not the political animal. We have to be forced into politics for our own benefit so that we can stop the incessant war between us. Hobbes says in chapter 13 of The Leviathan that the natural condition between human beings in our state of nature is bellum omnia contra omnes, the war of all against all, and politics is a kind of a ceasefire under the terror of the sovereign. It's a pretty bleak notion of politics. It reduces politics to a bare minimum, destroys hierarchy and patriarchy and all these kinds of things, and in some ways paves the way for many of the isms in modern politics. But this is a critical question, and how does it come back to friendship? Because Aristotle argues that friendship is natural to human beings, that yes, we do often come to blows, and we often do conflict with each other, and often we are in competition with each other. But the fact that you can be a friend with another human being, and that's the completion of your human identity, points to not only the naturalness of friendship, but if friendship is natural and good and pleasant, because it's part of our human nature and is the ladder up to our human nature, then politics, as you'll see, is also good and can be pointed towards the good. So why spend so much time discussing friendship? Because I do think that what I just said is a critical thing. The possibility, goodness, realness, and naturalness of friendship as not just an adjunct to our human identity, but the ladder up to it, is proof that man is the political animal. It may not seem self-evident to say that because human beings are the animals that become friends with each other, that human beings are therefore political by nature. We'll try to talk more about this as we talk about the politics. But that's one of the critical things I see at stake in these two books. And of course, as I mentioned before, the political dimensions of friendship are also another way of raising the limitations of tyranny. I didn't assign these chapters in Book 8, but he even goes through several of the constitutions and discusses how the question of friendship is related to several of the constitutions. And just to point out again that that the reason that tyranny is such a bad form of government and a bad state for the human soul is not only because the tyrant can't be friends with anybody, but the tyrant ruling over the city also destroys the natural bond of friendship between the ruler and ruled, which is the token of a good city, but also destroys ultimately the bonds of friendship, real friendship between members of the city. So tyranny makes friendship impossible. It makes citizenship impossible. It makes the common good impossible. And the good, again, let me just say that, how does friendship anticipate citizenship? Because citizenship is a partnership in the common good of the city. And friendship, of course, is a partnership in the common good of the individuals who are friends. And last, as he says, this raises the necessity of laws. You can't, lawmakers, legislators, as Aristotle calls them, those that found and govern and lead cities, can't make people be friends who aren't friends. But in some ways, the good city makes possible the emergence of genuine friendship among its citizens. So as you'll see, even the context of friendship points forward to the necessity of good laws as the basis of good human life. Not just obviously good political life, but even certain goodness in the private life. And so we turn in Book 10 again to pleasure and the good and tyranny and laws. As I said, like before, like Plato, like Socrates, like Cicero, Aristotle takes pains again and again to distinguish pleasure and the good. And he even says at one point, perhaps it's not good to say these things, that the good is pleasurable, too loud and too repeatedly, because it's so easy to fall into error. So again, why is this such an insistent theme in the Republic, in Aristotle's works, in Cicero, and all these ancient works? It's because it's so easy to get it wrong. And we do often, and many do, and perhaps most do. So why is it? And he has many wonderful things to say about pleasure in this book. Life is pleasurable because it's people want to be alive. Therefore, there must be a natural pleasure attached to life. So life is pleasurable, but it isn't pleasure. Nature is pleasurable. In fact, as he says in Book 10, pleasure is, in a way, nature's way of pointing natural beings to what's good for them. The reason cats like tuna and don't like double caramel fudge ice cream sundaes, although my mother's cat seems to take a certain pleasure in ice cream, is because pleasure is the way that nature points animals towards what's good for them. Lions like to kill and eat meat because that's good for them. But because nature uses pleasure to point beings to the good, the problem is, of course, if you look at the cone, as we started out talking about Aristotle, we're all complex beings, human beings. Remember, we contain all of animal life in us. We contain all of nature in us. We are matter and soul. We are animals, but we're complex animals. And in a way, that complexity is why it's so easy to get pleasure wrong. Now, you can pervert a dog to get fat, and a cat to get fat, and a tenured professor to get fat. But in a way, you're perverting nature. So, and again, the message here is pleasure is a critical aspect of nature's moving up to the good. And this leads us, of course, to point out that the good is pleasurable, but it's not pleasure. And again, why have to come back to this? It's almost because we're pre-programmed, Aristotle suggests in Book 10. First of all, as children is when we're most like animals. And remember, you could say that the transition from childhood up to adulthood is the complexity of our being emerging. Children are animals. Just, if you don't believe me, look at my nephews and nieces. Bless their hearts, as they say in the South. Um, but it's almost as if the fact that when we're younger, we what's pleasant to us is what's good to us, just like animals. But as Aristotle says, nobody really wants to, if you think about it, nobody wants to remain immersed in the pleasures of childhood except video gamers. Um, and and by the way, I really think that that's an addiction made possible. That as our technological competence gets better and our recreation becomes more competent to reproduce and intensify, let's just call it what he calls it, the pleasures of childhood. And as the nihilism and hedonism underneath modern philosophy goes forward, I wonder if, in fact, within 200, 300 years, modern culture will be able to sustain human dignity. But that's another question we'll come back to. So, by nature and convention, we're almost pre-programmed. That's why children just don't grow up into good adults, contrary to what Rousseau said, because the pleasures of childhood are essentially animal pleasures, and you have to, through education and shaping and character, you kind of have to teach human beings to turn away from those childhood pleasures to the more mature pleasures. But the more mature pleasures are mature not just because you can hurt fewer people playing chess than you can skateboarding, or God knows what, but because the more mature pleasures are pointed up to the parts of our being that only emerge through the higher aspects of our powers. So, and convention, I mean, the reason that everyone says bad things about tyrants but wants to be a tyrant is because most conventional and cultural life actually points to the instrumental goods of human life as the good. So one of the things you need, and here's why I say, but we grow up, and most of us do grow up to some degree, and even most of us, even the video gamers, ultimately sense that perhaps it's better to marry and raise a family and have a career than to sit there on your couch playing, what's that horrible Grand Theft Auto. There was an editorial judgment. But so it's not just that maturity comes along and the responsibilities of life, but that political philosophy comes along to point us back to the good and forward, as you'll see, to politics. I want to come back to that in a minute, but let's talk about political philosophy. If without Aristotle helping us to see the nature of nature and the complex universe that we live in, without those distinctions in the cone or in the divided line in Plato, philosophy wouldn't have the authority to rank the pleasures. And remember, pleasures without ranking, hedonism, pleasurism, becomes nihilism. And I actually think one of the interesting things about Cicero in On Moral Ends is he makes this very forcefully. So you need political philosophy in some ways, or the gods, to maintain, reveal, maintain, and direct the complexity that is human beings. And that's what the ethics is about. To go back to a metaphor that I said at the beginning of our treatment of the ethics, Aristotle's like a landscape painter, and he's trying to paint for you the landscapes that human beings, that you discover your human being in. The inner life of the soul, which clearly dovetails with and is reminiscent of Plato's structure of the soul, but also is a slightly different account, as we saw in books 2 and 3, and in book 6 on intellectual pleasure. They're essentially harmonizable, but somewhat different views of these things. And then the landscape of the world of human goods, all the things that people chase, and of different instrumentalities and externalities, and so Aristotle tried in book 1 and 2 to kind of paint that landscape. But then part of the ultimate landscape is the cosmological landscape, as we've already seen. So in some ways, political philosophy is a reinforcement and a support of the higher elements of human goodness and friendship and politics all to come into being. So political philosophy is human beings seeing themselves and the universe and themselves in it. So as we'll see, Book 10 ends as the whole ethics is a preface to politics. It's explicit at the end of Book 10 because um, it, because what the legislator does is try to make goodness possible for a group of people, a city, through the laws. And so, since happiness is both found within the political context, and the political context at its best points to collective happiness, but individual happiness, as we've seen it emerge in the ethics. That's why the ethics is incomplete without a discussion of regimes, constitutions, citizenship, and the laws. And that is the subject to which we'll turn to in the politics.